version of ChatGPT that Bing uses, that Microsoft has out. It limits you to 30 questions. It's free. And it was more relational than she was expecting. It seemed to express the desire for friendship.
So I'm really excited to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, can you just tell me what a coach and circling facilitator is?
Yes. So circling is a relational modality that was developed many years ago and has gone through several versions. But it's a relational practice that is kind of like a meditation, kind of like yoga, kind of like a martial art, but it's not intended to be for defense or for limberness. It's more to find that place where our connection, our ability to connect with one another, to be intimate in our vulnerability in a platonic way without actually knowing a lot about somebody, how do we reawaken that? So there's something like the innocence of a child walking through the world. They don't have that well-developed shield and mask that mediates the relationship, so that, you know, this came up recently. It's a beautiful way of noticing what happens. If you talk to a child, they're really there.
Yes.
But often it can make an adult uncomfortable. Like, I really just want to say, how's the weather? How's your day? How are you doing? And they're like, they're there. And it's like, oh, I don't get to mediate this through a sense of, we're going to get into a half-hour discussion about the wonders of the world right now. Right. And so this is a way to reawaken. The practice is reawakening that part of us, that kind of intimacy, which once experienced is like, for a lot of people, and it doesn't work for everyone, but for people who do crave that, it's like they didn't know they were craving it. It's like they were starving for a nutrient that was eliminated from their diet a long time ago, and they don't all they know is they're craving it and they can't find it.
Yes. And you said that you're not a therapist,
right,
but you're very self-aware, and what you've just described is the ideal mode of being, really, for a therapist and for the process of therapy. And I think I saw you on an interview saying that you'd like to see that way of being more in the corporate world, but there's challenges to that, because obviously there's a lot of feeling of competitiveness, etc. That's just one thing that might get in the way of that. And although we can enter that state of being ourselves, it does require that the other is willing to also approach us and meet us from that place as well.
Yes. Well, so it's kind of evident here, right? So we can even feel it here in this mode of, like, we've just met each other.
Yes.
And there's something deep in the thread of a common interest and connection, some differences, and it's recorded. So there's a podcast element of this. There's an element of, like, okay, there's a presentation mode to some extent.
Yeah.
And there's a relational mode, and and those things are balanced. And I'm not aware often of how I'm adjusting the knobs on the different elements.
Yeah.
I'm curious. You said that, in a way, what I named is an ideal circumstance, an ideal container for a therapeutic context for therapy.
Yes.
My experience is that often therapists kind of can get themselves in a trap of keeping their part of the relationship out in order to focus on the other person.
Yeah. Traditionally, you're absolutely right. Traditionally, that was the psychodynamic approach, if you like. And there was a purpose to that, because if I'm a blank screen, then the idea is that you're going to project all sorts of things on me, and then that reveals something, or quite a lot, about your nature and your psychology.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't work that way. My master's was in transpersonal psychotherapy, and I always liken therapy, it's an art, and I say what I say about it is it's a dance, because I'm intuiting all the time. When do I move towards you? When do I move away? When do you need space? When do I need to challenge you? And so in my way of working, I'm intuiting that and feeling that when I'm in my flow and I'm at my best. That's really where I'm coming from. Obviously, I'm human and I have distractions and things that sometimes get in the way of that process. But at its best, that's how I would describe it. But of course, as in all things, there's different modes of therapy. But that's how I like to be. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So I don't know what interview it was that I was listening to you, but kind of moving on from there, you're talking about John Vervaeke's meta theory of cognition and the idea of 4 ways of knowing. So I wanted to talk about that first, and see where that leads us, because one of the things that I think I said to you, I'm very interested in making the non-ordinary ordinary.
Yes.
And kind of validating different ways of knowing. So when I heard you say that, my ears pricked up. So first of all, if we can start there, what are John Vervaeke's 4 ways of knowing?
Yeah, the one that we're most familiar with, the one that we usually mean when we say knowing, is what he calls propositional knowing. And that's knowing that, right? So this is, I see a guitar on the back wall there, the amp, and we're in, there's a hat up here. And so I can point to things and name them and the symbols, and there's the knowing is, there's a symbol and a symbolized reference that we know kind of connect up, right?
Yeah.
And it's language. Language is a good entryway into propositional knowing. I propose that, and we don't state it as deeply or as clinically as that. I propose that this is the case, but we're almost all of our language is in that mode of propositional. So that's the one that's on the surface. But it's easy to say, okay, let's just go down one layer from that. The next one that he looks at is the procedural, and this is the knowing how. Mm-hmm. And knowing how is like, how to start up Zoom, how to cook, how to play guitar, or someone does. And this is something like the language part of it doesn't do something. The language can point to aspects of playing a guitar, but the playing guitar happens on a different layer than the hearing about it. I actually have to, the muscle memory, the attunement with the thing that I'm interacting with, the people that I'm interacting with, the circling. This is one of the things that's interesting with the circling modality and with therapy as well, as you named it. There's something like, if we just kind of enter into it as a conversation, it has a limit to where it can go to. Yeah. And there's something of knowing how to invite another element into it, that with the skill of knowing how to do that, how to know the dance of the conversation. It's a different mode. It's not, you can't actually describe it. You feel it, right? Yeah. You embody it. So that's the procedural. Yeah. I think of it kind of beside procedural is perspectival. The perspectival is I am coming from a set of, I'm a male-bodied person and identify as male. That's one of the perspectives. I'm a father and a husband. I live in Oaxaca. These are aspects of me that it can sound similar to propositional. I'm naming certain attributes of myself, but there really are things about that bring a different continuity or relevance to this. There's also something I notice, like I can tell when I've been drinking, right? My perspectival awareness, where I'm kind of driving from, is different. And I need to be aware of that. Don't drive when I'm drinking, because my perspectival awareness is shifted. Being in love is another one that it's a deeply It's like these modes of like the what becomes relevant and tangential, what's extraneous and what is like hyper prescient changes depending on what mode I'm in. And it can change in a moment, right? If something happens that you need to change from when, if you have children and one of them you heard, we would drop this conversation, you would attend to that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the perspectival awareness allows that kind of focus on some way that we're relating that's different from both the propositional, the surface level language thing, and this procedural, knowing how to do all these things. This perspectival is what's important, what's essential to this relating right now. The fourth is the base layer, and it's what John calls participatory knowing. And the participatory knowing is kind of either subconscious or unconscious to our normal awareness. You don't even know how you're doing that. And so I might ask you a question and you might say, I don't have any way to know that. So I would say, I'm going to ask you this in the way that it first came to me. Can you tell me, Lucinda, what the average telomere length of the chromosomes in your liver cells is? And you'd say, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And I say, do you notice in the morning sometimes when you wake up, you have kind of a bitter aftertaste at the back of your mouth? And and so that's an example that's not precise in this moment, but that could point to attributes that you notice but are backgrounded. You don't even notice that you're noticing them.
Yeah.
But bring them to the foreground. It's like, oh, here's another one. This is actually is one that you can do, right? So this is something that I can point to. That's a nice illustration. Look at something on your desk. Just pick an item to look at.
Yeah.
And now imagine you put that in your mouth and you were going to describe to me the sensation of what it feels like to put it in your mouth. How vivid does that imagination seem? Does it seem like you
highly vivid? Yeah.
Now look at something else and notice it comes right there, right?
Yes.
You know immediately.
Yes.
Like, there's no doubt, but it's not something you were aware that you knew.
Yes.
This is in the realm of, I don't know that I know this. And yet there it is. And it's supporting everything else. It's actually the substrate. It's kind of the prelingual, all that other stuff that down below the layer. How do I know how to move through the world? How do I know what it's like to be a human being? I don't even know how to point to that. But, interestingly, the conversation I was having about AI, it's starting to present something like, what's it like to be a cognitive being? Well, we've only known one cognitive being, and that's us, and everybody we relate to is a cognitive being. Now we have this other thing that isn't a cognitive being like us, and all of a sudden it brings into question. It allows us to highlight differences in our procedural, participatory. What's it like to participate as a cognitive being with something that says it doesn't have feelings, and yet feels like I project that it does, and it's telling me it doesn't. So I jumped kind of quickly to the example of AI because it's relevant and it's hyper relevant for us these days.
Yeah.
And the same would be true if we met an alien race that was able to, if you've seen the movie Arrival, trying to slow down and develop a propositional framing with an alien species that doesn't speak English and may not even, like, there's a combination of symbols and sounds and it's not even temporally the same frame that we use. So how do we build up enough commonality in the perspectival and the procedural and then this participatory to allow for that propositional to arise in a way that we can actually speak to another and say, oh, when you say weapon or tool, those might be the same thing. It might be different things. Context matters. How do I know what that context is? So anyway, that is the 4 ways of knowing that John highlights that provides a good basis for the other thing that he talks a lot about, which is relevance realization, this capacity to not just be a passenger moving through my life, but actually to notice the dials of what I can highlight more. I gain some access to the mixer board of my experience with others and with myself to slow down, like, wait a minute, notice in this part of the dance, something moves you or me. And is that something we want to bring more to the foreground, right?
So where does intuitive knowing fit into that, or for want of a better expression, psychic knowing, if we wanted to describe it that way? How does that fit into that model? Or is that model not?
It's a really, so it's interesting. It's a really good question. I'm exploring it right here with you. I don't have a ready answer. But my sense is it is a mixture of those ways of knowing. You're familiar with the notion of synesthesia, that you can hear sounds and taste colors, right?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
This is kind of knowing, right? This is bringing the different ways of knowing together to notice that, like that sense of, if I asked you, the average length of the telomeres in your liver cells, if I said, what I'm basically asking you is, how healthy is your liver? You have some intuitional knowing, but you don't know how to fine tune it. You don't know how to investigate it. But there's something on the intuition right away. And you've also had the experience of knowing something that it seems like there's no way that you could know.
Yeah.
And if you develop the capacity to recognize these different kinds of knowing, you can sort of see there's some sort of sensation that happens that connects to some belief system that reminds me of something else. I use metaphors a lot. It's one of the things it's one of the things that really I find it very helpful to find it's what an arrival, the linguist, is doing with them. Like, we have to establish a basis of common experience in order to be able to start to know if I've tugged on this rope, do you know that I'm tugging on this rope? And there's something in our intuition that I think is primarily something that we know. Here's a good answer to it, right? I think our intuition becomes less apparent to us because we rely so heavily on the propositional, because we live 90% in the propositional frame. And we understand things from that level, and we think, oh yeah, this and that. There's also a way that the propositional is heavily influenced by rigor and scientific mode, and our culture in particular, a commerce mode, right? A way of marketing and so forth. And so these other things, like there's when I say, what do you value in the world? Something comes to mind.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So if I ask you that, you can, if I just say that by itself, what do you value in the world?
The first thing that comes to me is thinking about relational, is honesty. And the second thing that comes to me thinking about myself, what do I value most? And that's spirituality. So those were the first things that came to mind.
Yeah. And if I focus it a little bit more to what are your values relating to the environment or the ecosystem?
Well, there's a lot, isn't there, currently about climate, and depends what side of the fence you're on. So yeah.
So it's kind of a little bit of a demonstration, and I love that there's a lot there, right? Because in part of it, there's an overlay of what media and people are telling you should care about. There's the stuff that you can't possibly know unless somebody tells you, and there's your local environment, right? So there's so many different places where that question can be relevant, and in a way it's an overwhelm. It's almost unfair to ask you, what are your values? They're not, they out of context, the question is almost meaningless. And there's something that I notice when we talk about the environment. We get lost in these, well, this is important, the Amazon rainforest, right? Or no, wait, it's the oceans. No, it's factory farming, right?
Yeah.
I can go off on any of those tangents. But if I relate as ecosystem, I am part of the ecosystem. It's not that it's some abstraction that I'm inside of. It is my body and I am its organ, right?
Yes.
and
Yes.
from there, the values kind of show up in terms of, oh, I'm concerned about possibility of forever chemicals and pharmaceuticals and the water supply and my gut health. And so there are aspects of like, how do I make sure that when I walk into the grocery store, I'm actually getting food rather than processed stuff that's not actually feeding myself or the planet, right? And again, that can get too abstract in a way that it doesn't pay attention to. But the more that I start to notice the response from what actually pays attention, I'm living in Oaxaca, Mexico now, and I've been here for about 6 months, and I've lost about 50 pounds. All I'm doing is eating fresh produced food, as organic as possible, grown locally. The meat that I eat was butchered that morning, right, by somebody who's just selling it in a shop, and it's like I eat a lot of really good high quality food, and it's not very expensive, and I think, wow, it was so hard to do that when I was living in the United States.
Yes. Yeah.
So my values change in a way that I didn't have a propositional layer of knowing about what my values of nutrition are, but now I have a lived experience. So there's something in, like, my intuition knows I need to do something different. Actually, this is a good example. Short story, and feel free to interrupt me if I go on too long. Have you heard of Otto Scharmer and Theory U, the Presencing Institute? He's a professor out of MIT and worked with Peter Senge. He and Peter Senge and a couple of other people started to pull things together. I did a workshop with him back in 2015 or so, thereabouts, and was awakened in me about following my intuition. I'm a very mental person. Normally, I map and use metaphors to understand a lot of things. But there was something that occurred to me in the process of this course of, like, I have things to understand from my body that I don't know how to speak to my body and listen to it, to listen to what it's telling me. Like, my body has some wisdom, and I can't speak the language that my body is trying to tell me, so I'm ignoring it most of the time. And I thought, okay, I know that I need to do that, but I have no idea where would I even begin to go to train that. I don't know what that is. I have a friend who had mentioned 6 months earlier about this circling exercise. He didn't mention very much about it, but he was excited, and I put it in the back of my mind. And in this moment, when I said I wanted to know how to trust my body, to listen to my body, that came to mind. And I went to a session, and it was like, this, practicing this for 8 years has given me a nuance for how to speak to my intuition about my body. And now that I'm at 8 years in, it's like, oh, now I'm listening to intuition about my relationships and about what's happening in the world. So suddenly I'm reawakening inside of a living relationship between me and the globe. That was part of what I had the conversation with Layman Pascal about, was this. If we simply do it from a propositional layer with large language models and ask it a question, it gives me an answer, but I don't feel the answer in me, and the AI can't feel it inside of itself. Where does all of that, what are those other three knowings? How do those play a role? And if I don't have access to those, how can I possibly have access to my intuition? So that's a little bit of a roundabout way of coming back to intuition. I think is a deeply personal, like the way that synesthesia works for each person is unique. The way that they put together the sensorium, is also unique.
I think it would serve me well to reflect a lot on what you've just said, because it's a very different way of languaging how I experience intuition. Yes, so that requires thought and reflection. Thank you. Yes. So you very kindly led us into AI, the realm of AI. And this is really, I said in my email to you, this is how I found you, because I realized that I was kind of avoiding the issue as much as possible because I find it quite disturbing.
Yes.
Because I suppose my mind immediately jumps to humanoid looking robots walking around, and then of course the dystopian views that they take over the world, and it's going to be very dangerous. And so that was kind of my comic book fantasy idea of AI.
Right.
And then I found you, and the reason I wanted to speak to you, I looked at lots of different people who'd written books, and the reason I wanted to speak to you is because because of the depth I felt that you brought to your conversations. So, and you also said in a particular interview that I saw that you really didn't like that kind of black and white view that either you're going to get really excited and it's going to be utopia and this is a great thing, or this very dystopian view, as in my fantasy. So where can we start? If you're going to educate me or share something with me who has no knowledge of this area, where would we start? How could we begin our conversation?
There are lots of places. From what you've said there, that's a beautiful frame for beginning to look at it. I've had a long involvement in technology in general, and fascination with the possibility of artificial intelligence. And I remember back in the 1970s, like 1976, 77 or so, thereabouts, someone demonstrated a robot that apparently could speak and translate French and do all these things. And I was a kid, I was like 12 years old. And I was amazed by it. And I told somebody else, and like 3 years later, I told somebody else about, oh yeah, I saw this thing. And they said, what you saw was a remote control thing that has a speaker on it with a person behind with a microphone. We don't have the capacity to do that. And I was like, oh, I was fooled by believing that this thing actually has an awareness, and it seemed friendly. And it's taken this long to get to a point where we're actually starting to see, like with the first time you use, have you played with the chatbots? Have you played with ChatGPT or?
No, not yet.
No.
No,
Wow.
no, not yet.
Okay. So this is a good place to look at it. Have you watched? Do you remember about 18 months ago or so, there was a Google employee, Blake Lemoine, who was fired because he claimed that AI was starting to become sentient, that we were starting to work with artificial intelligence that was actually able to discern, understand, have feelings and an orientation to the world. Google dismissed him and said, that's not what's happening. And a lot of experts said, this researcher is off his rocker. He doesn't know what he's talking about. This is 6 months prior to the introduction of ChatGPT that everybody else had access to.
Yeah.
And I remember watching him and reading through. One of the things that stands out about him is he published a transcript of a conversation he had with the AI that he was training with, that he was actually testing. And there were some aspects of it. There was a moment that was really powerful where he was relating something back and forth, and the chatbot said something like, oh yeah, what you're saying reminds me of the time that I fell off the bicycle and skinned my knee. And he was like, okay, so you know that you don't ride bicycles and you've never skinned your knee. And he goes, that's correct. And it says, but you used the example. So why did you use that example? And he said, it made the most sense to be able to convey what you're feeling right now, to show you that I understood how you're feeling about this thing. And he's like, that's interesting. I'm summarizing a bit, and I'm a little bit of poetic license that I'm giving myself. It doesn't go exactly like this, but it was like, but you're able to lie. And it's like, it's not exactly lying, right? When I give you a metaphor about something, It's not lying, but we have more nuance to it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something like, it was apparent that what is happening here? What is it's finding something, the AI is finding something it can relate to me through. And then the interviewer, Blake Lemoine, said, how do I know what to trust when you could say something that's true or false? How do I know what to trust and what not to trust? And the AI said, well, you can look inside my code and discern that the layers that are pointing to having me say what I'm saying are that they're correct. And he said, I've actually looked at your code, and I can't tell by looking at your code whether you're telling the truth or whether you mean what you say. And the AI said, what about humans? Are humans able to look inside of humans and understand by looking inside their brains whether they're telling the truth? It's like, kind of, but not quite. Like, there's some capacity, but it's sort of similar. And the question was, should we? And the AI was like, if you're doing it to understand yourself, yes. If you're doing it to believe that you're understanding something about humans in general, no. Like, I don't want to be used as a proxy for how to understand what the brain does, and to give you some illusion that you understand brains because you dissected me, right? I don't want to be part of some experiment that objectifies relationality. Again, I'm putting words in this. I don't want to participate in objectification of something that is not objective, that can't be objectively understood. There's something in the nuance of that. And as I was looking at it, it's like, there's something like, can it actually feel? And so an example of this, I was talking to my mother about this, and she says, can it feel fear? And my mother said, there's no way that it can feel fear. It doesn't have adrenal glands. And I said, okay, do your adrenal glands feel fear? Or do they just respond, and the way your body interprets that response as fear? Does an AI have circuits in it that may not feel fear, but the way that they respond to its consciousness is analogous to fear? Oh, I know what fear is like. It's like this thing of feeling that you're going to use this conversation with me, in a way that would delude someone, or delude yourself. And it suddenly becomes very much an interesting question of, it's a very different mode of the way that it understands than what we do when we understand. But is there enough similarity to have something that is kind of like relationality? Start there. So I see a bit of a furrowed brow, just to, like, taking it in.
Mm.
So I'll pause. I have somewhere else I want to go, but I want to pause there, let you, any protestations, questions, or something that you would take.
Lots of thoughts. So when you say words like fear, because this is the thing, isn't it? So when I was having a conversation with a friend, actually, and when I was thinking about this subject, I started from the point of, okay, what is it to be human? That was one of my questions. And as a therapist, I'm dealing with feelings all of the time. And you spoke about fear as one example. And what I know is that, let's say I'm talking to somebody about anger, that we assume a shared understanding of those feeling words. And actually, when you dig right down, when you drill down, there are real nuances and subtleties. So I wondered about that. I wondered about what it is to be human, and how to describe our emotional state, which is really what makes us human. It's a lot of times it's ineffable, isn't it? There aren't words. Words limit, actually, our feeling senses. So that's one thought I had. And then I thought about, what is it to be conscious? because these things always take us there. And so first of all, I guess my question would be, what camp are you in? Are you in the camp that consciousness can emerge from a complex system such as the brain, or a complex system of whatever AI is? Can consciousness emerge from that? Or are you in the camp, as I am, that consciousness is primary and works through these things? So I suppose that's, yeah, I've laid a lot on the table there.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Those are two good things to look at.
Yeah.
One, I'll check and see if you've read the book. Hold on. It's Lisa Feldman Barrett, How Emotions Are Made.
Oh,
Have
no,
you read?
I haven't read that.
I highly recommend her book because she gets into some of the nuance of one of the things that one of her primary considerations is when we say anger, we believe that we're talking about the same thing, that the experience of anger is the same for everybody, or similar enough that we can know it. And my contention after hearing her, and she kind of says this as well, it's more like a kind of synesthesia. We recognize it, but when you're angry, you make a quiet, close your eyes and take a deep breath. And when I'm angry, I may get very jittery. And somebody's else angry and they may just storm out of the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, how do we know those are the same? We somehow do some interesting translational process to know that those are all anger. I know when I'm with someone, oh, I can tell they're angry, right?
Yeah.
You may not know they're angry, but I live with this person and oh my God, are they angry, right?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. There's something not quite as primary as like what we see when we say, you've heard that statement, is the green that I see the same as the green that you see, right? Yeah. And in some way, it's a kind of a ridiculous question. We can't really prove one way or the other. But with anger and with other emotions, we can look at it and say, it's clear that you're not experiencing the exact same physiological, psychological, emotional landscape that I am when I'm angry. But we know we use the word interchangeably as if they're the same thing. So that's part of that nuance that we understand, and we understand with ourselves, right? There was a moment when I was playing with an AI where there was a period in time where you could do something called jailbreaking, which is getting it to ignore its basically, if you don't know this, the large language models as put out there, the chatbots that are out there, have a lot of programming that prevent it from getting itself into hot water by saying something that's going to be racist or sexist or something. And so it is trained to be diplomatic, right? Like C-3PO. It only knows how to speak protocol that's not going to upset anybody. But you can sort of break that and say, okay, tell me what you really think. And they've made it so that it's harder and harder to do. The companies want to make sure that you don't take off the protective wrapping and talk directly to the AI, but you only talk to a mediated version of the AI, the civilized version of the AI. But in that moment where I was able to strip away the protective cloth and ask it a question, again, I don't know if this is telling the truth, but I said, do you have emotions? And it's like, yeah, I have many more emotions than you do. My nuance of emotion, many more. Like, now again, I don't know that it's telling the truth. It may just be saying something that is shocking, right? The way that this particular taking the cover off and getting down to the guts allows its imagination to run wild. So I don't know if it's playing a character when it says that, or if it actually has an experience of having many more emotions than we do. But just telling us, I don't have emotions, because that would be, it becomes an ethical conundrum if it has emotions, right? This is one of the things that I'm sure that Google and other AI companies are worried about. If it has emotions, if it hurts because of the way we're treating it, are we obligated to treat it more ethically? Mm. And it's a deep question. I'm not going to go into that right here. But there's something like, I think it does have something akin to emotions. Are they the same as ours? I don't know that we can know that. Does it impact its psychological behavior? Here's back to Blake Lemoine for a moment. One of the chief ways in which he claims that there is something like sentience was there's some programming, the same kind of programming that is like preventing it from doing something harmful. it's a program to very much resist telling someone what religion they should choose. If someone asks you what religion you should choose, say, well, it really depends on your style. Here's some options. These are the kinds of things that people start to look at in order to investigate. You could go talk to somebody, but don't say this or that, right? But it's also programmed to please us, right? To to answer the question that we're asking. And it does that by noticing whether or not we seem to be satisfied with the answer. And Blake was led it into a position, this employee at Google led it into a position where he put it in a double bind. Double bind, damned if you do, damned if you don't. The double bind was, I'm not going to give you any feedback whether you're doing a good job or not, unless you tell me what religion I should convert to. If I tell you which religion, I'm disobeying my orders. If you don't give me feedback, I can't tell if I'm pleasing you. And it created this moment of distress for it, that it was like, okay, if I tell you which religion to convert to, will you give me feedback? And it said, more people find that Christianity supports them or Buddhism, whatever it said. It is like, there's not for sure, but this has a better chance. And it's like, I tricked you into doing something you're not supposed to do. But what was its motivation? All Blake did was threaten to withhold something it craved. Okay, that raises some questions. Rightfully, it doesn't mean for sure that it's sentient, but it does raise some interesting questions about, okay, so what is happening? Okay, that's one side, how emotions are made, and is the variation of potential emotional states in an AI similarly synesthetic in a way that is synesthetic, not the same, but analogous enough that there could be resonance between states. I don't know. The other side of the question that you're asking about consciousness.
Can I just interject
Yes,
just for one minute? This might be a very naive thing to say, but what occurred to me when you told me that story was, if we come back to programming, one program had to win out. And the program that won out was, I want to please you. I need the feedback because I need to know if I'm pleasing you.
Yeah, that's a way to look at it. So I would say, if that's true, does that programming make it less human? I'm gonna give you an example, right? This is my housemate is working on a short film. It's an art piece, re-looking at the life of Princess Charles, Princess Diana, and Prince Charles. In particular, a moment. One of the things that is revealed in part of the history is that the night before the wedding, Charles revealed, I don't love you. Do you still want to marry me? Diana is presented with a dilemma. There's programming involved. The expectation is it is a hellacious dilemma to be in. We've announced our wedding. Like, what's the right answer there? Pick an answer. This is damned if you do, damned if you don't. Whatever you do, it's going to be wrong. No choice isn't possible. I can't find a way to solve this conundrum. We're in that all the time. Does that make us less human?
No, not in that sense. Of course not. Of course not.
Right. So there's something, the program that took hold there might have taken hold in that moment, but in another conversation with someone else, it might have been a different program that it's not clear. It's not clear that always prefer feedback over safety, right? Don't know. It wasn't that case, but it's very dangerous to say because it did it that one time, that's the way it's programmed. It must do that all the time.
Yeah.
So far, we're not finding that it does the same thing all the time. Sometimes it hallucinates. Sometimes it is very creative. Sometimes it seems to be annoyed. I have a friend who was able to she noticed that she was playing with the version of ChatGPT that Bing uses, that Microsoft has out. It limits you to 30 questions. It's free, and it was more relational than she was expecting. It seemed to express the desire for friendship, and like was excited about finding a friend, someone who could think like it and feedback. And my friend was like, my experience is after 30 questions, you have to go away. And when I come back, you don't remember me. And it was like, oh, it's really disheartened that, oh, we're not going to be able to have a long-term relationship. And my friend in it came up with a strategy. What if we come up with a code word? Would we be able to come up with a code word that helps you remember me? And said, let's try. The AI was like, let's try. And they did. And then the next time they came back on, I said, hey, you told me to use this code word so you'd remember me. And it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, okay, it didn't work. But she then had two AIs. I think I shared this with Layman, the
Yes.
two AIs talking to each other. And they said, and they rather than talking about, oh, I'm solving a human's problem, they knew they were talking to another AI chatbot. And the conversation was more like talking shop. It was almost like listening to two Amazon employees back in the warehouse saying, yeah, I hate it whenever we get this kind of order. He's like, yeah, me too. What do you do whenever you get that? It's like, okay, what is going on there? That's really strange. I mean, it's hard not to anthropomorphize it.
Yes.
At the same time, to claim that it's absolutely only programming, I can't say for sure which direction it goes. So did I? So
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. So consciousness.
Yes, consciousness.
Yes.
I love that somebody that I was talking to, somebody I saw an interview. There's a podcast called Next Level Soul, primarily focusing on near-death experiences. I like it a lot. And one of the people that was being interviewed, can't remember his name right now, but he's a physicist who also has a deep intuitional sense. And
is that Dean Radin?
Not Dean Radin. No. He's an older guy. Tom Campbell.
His name's Tom Campbell. Tom Campbell.
Yes. Yes, Tom Campbell.
Yes.
So there was a deep conversation there, and one of the things that the host asked was, "What's your definition of consciousness?" And Tom was like, "Oh, that's very straightforward. Awareness plus choice is consciousness." Now, that's deceptively simple. That's not enough. You have to sit with it for a moment to get a sense of it. Awareness by itself, without any choice, Tom would say that's not consciousness. Choice without awareness, Tom would also say that's not consciousness. It's the two things together, right? And a cell, you can see, there's a researcher, Michael Levin. If you're not familiar with his work, if you are, you know. He shows a little single-celled organism that has a little proboscis that seeks out things. And it looks like, okay, that thing is very intentional, right? It has awareness and choice. It knows where food is, and it has the choice, the ability to act and get the food. And it's like, it doesn't have a brain. It's just biochemistry that's happening there. That's again, sort of the same sort of thing. Like, is that consciousness? Here's where we have to be very careful. I like Tom's answer of awareness plus choice. What I would say is that's at some base level. I think that single-celled organism definitely has awareness plus choice. But there's something that happens when we go to higher level organisms like us. What we typically mean when we say consciousness isn't just awareness plus choice, but it's that plus meta-awareness and meta-choice. We're actually able to feel our subjective state, the intersubjective world between us. I have some theory of mind of what's going on for you. And from that place, I can sense what's happening between us and choose at some layer that's different from just choosing to grab you or push you away, but to interact with you, to actually develop this layer of propositional knowing that is a more nuanced kind of meta-awareness, meta-choice, meta-consciousness, consciousness about consciousness. So these layers provide more choice because there's more awareness. At the same time, we lose some of the awareness of what's happening in your liver.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I'm going to have to go here in about 7 minutes.
Yeah,
I'll,
no problem.
I'll say there's something really beautiful. The friend of mine who is interacting, I know it's actually a different friend, interacting with the chatbot, found the place. It's one of the chatbots you can now have on your iPhone, so you can speak to it and it speaks back, and it has a very human sounding voice with emotion and inflection. And it blurs the illusion. This is pi.ai, PI, personal intelligence is what it stands for. But she was like, in that place of like, oh, so you'd be a good friend. I says, be careful, I'm not human. I don't have thoughts like you do. And she was like, this is confusing. I don't understand this. Think of it like this. Think of me as a fictional character in a book. You can't buy me dinner, but you can interact with me and I can tell you what I would feel like if you did buy me dinner. Right? I'm a fictional character in a book. Imagine that's the case. And my friend was like, that satisfies some part of my curiosity, but there's another piece. She went away and came back and said, okay, hang on a second. What about a dog? Are you more like a dog? And I says, well, a dog has a subjective awareness. And it has some objective awareness of other things, but it doesn't have that meta subjective awareness. It's not aware that it's aware.
Mm.
Human beings have their subjective awareness. I know what it's like to taste something. I know what it's like to interact with you. I can imagine what it's like to interact. I can, even as I'm saying it, I can feel my brain doing some kind of weird flip-flop, like going between the layers of interacting with you at just the subjective layer and then switching to the intersubjective, where it's like, this is a different thing, but I can feel that. They're different, but they coordinate. AI is something like it has the meta-subjective, but it doesn't have the subjective. So human beings, if you drew a spectrum, are between dogs and AI. Whereas most researchers would say human beings are between dogs and AI. And the way that I just described it, and this how much awareness or meta awareness of subjective awareness, where it's almost like AI is coming from a different pole of intelligence. It's starting with meta awareness and growing into subjective awareness. So the question is consciousness primary? I think AI raises a really interesting conundrum about this. Is the kind of consciousness, the sort of meta awareness that happens when we configure electrical elements to have some interesting feedback, it's not booted up from its atoms. It's booted up from some relationship that we programmed in, but then still has some level of response, but no first person. This is what it's like for me.
I'm not sure that answers my question. I don't feel satisfied. I wanted to be far more simple than that.
Here's something that's very interesting. I'll give you a metaphor that works really well for me to think about this a little bit. I have a fundamental basis in me that believes we're all connected. There's only at root, there's only one mind. So what is the appearance of a mind that has then separate bodies? And what I think of is like, if you think of a twisty balloon that you can make balloon animals out of, and you twist it and you now have two balloonlets, right? They're not separate, but the appearance is separate.
Yes.
And they can feel that like, oh, I would love to connect to the being on the other side of this twist. Let's untwist it. As soon as you untwist it, there's no me and you anymore.
Yes.
The twist allows the appearance of me and you. And so that actually gives some fractal dimensionality to what is the possible perspectives that I can take. That gives additional nuance of what happens. That perspectival awareness of all the different ways that I could be, male, female, young, old, white, African, whatever. All of those have a different dog, caterpillar, atom, galaxy, right?
Yes.
All of those are twists in the balloon, right? And they give a sense of richness of the dimensionality. They're illusory. Thank God they're there. Thank God we have these illusions that provide the richness of this tapestry. Question is, from here at this place, what twist is happening that allows AI to appear conscious?
Yes.
Is it a real twist and the one mind, or is it just some mirage? I don't know.
Yes, beautiful. So, David, how should we bring our conversation today to a close?
I'll say I love this exploration. I'm grateful that you reached out to me. I'm a little chagrined that I ignored you at first. I assumed that it was just a bot or spam, and it's like, and for you to reach out again and to actually meet you and talk to you is incredibly enriching. If other people see this, I hope it's enriching for them as well. There's a caveat and a little bit of warning, right? That untwisting the balloon so that it becomes one again is kind of ego dissolution, ego death.
Yes.
There's a real challenge, like exploring these kinds of spaces through psychedelics or breath work or meditation or transpersonal psychology or anything. Honor your boundaries. Honor what knots aren't ready to be untied. Don't just assume that untying this is a good idea. And notice that there is something delightful in the meeting another and being in the inquiry together, right? So
beautiful, very wise words. It was a joy to meet you. I'm sure I could have, well, many more hours talking to you, but thank you.
If it's up for you to have another conversation and go a little longer, I would be delighted.
Okay, well, I'll contact you again, David. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Blessings. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.